5 steps to coaching up or out. And like David said, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, when we start getting into the coaching progression checklist and we start having these conversations, up is the way we go. Very rarely do we have to coach people out. But if we do have to coach people out, we have to do it in a way that is going to prevent the poison pill. We can't have the well get poisoned because one of your staff blows up because they had no idea they were about to get fired. Anybody ever had to let somebody go and they had no idea it was coming? Anybody want to be really honest and admit to having that happen before? I'll admit to having that happen before. It's awful. It's awful for them. It's awful for you. It's awful for the whole team, that maybe the team saw it, maybe they didn't. Maybe none of the team saw it coming either. And now all of a sudden, the team's going, holy cow, they just fired Susie. I thought Susie was great. She was such a nice person. Susie was so nice and so pleasant. And that's when you don't have a scoreboard, you don't know if you're winning or losing. And that goes for each person in the team as well as the practice. What's the first thing we need to do? Well, here's a motto that you should have in your practice. Feedback early and feedback often. You can never give too much feedback. How can we highlight opportunities for improvement early? How can we talk about improvement as soon as you can see it? After you see it, how can you relay that back to them? This is going to give you the opportunity to engage them in a positive way. So it's not just all about what they're doing wrong, right? Nobody wants to hear about all they're doing wrong. I would guess if the only thing you told your spouse was what he or she did wrong, that wouldn't work real well. It wouldn't work for me really well. I don't think, David, it would work for you really well either. I can't speak for everybody here in the webinar tonight, but we all need positive feedback for what we need to do well or what we did well and what we need to keep doing well. Be mindful of the things you give feedback on. We don't want to overwhelm people either. This is about creating the culture of learning. This is not about right and wrong. And oftentimes when something goes wrong, we make it that somebody did something wrong. And there's no mistakes. There's only lessons. And lessons are repeated until they get learned. And you know that a lesson has been learned when the behavior changes. And this culture of learning and constantly improving is what you've got to get your team in the mindset of. I talk through my team with, I say mistakes are okay. Mistakes are okay to make. I don't want to make the same mistake twice, and I don't want to make a slow mistake, right? I don't want people moving really slow and making a mistake. Then that's kind of making like 2 mistakes at the same time. You move slow and you goofed up. So let's figure out what's the quickest way to find the path that isn't going to work, and iterate on this thing, and then move through and find the outcome that's going to work. I mean, how many light bulbs did Edison test before he found the one that worked? How many electric cars and batteries did my life coach, Elon, test before he figured out what was going to work? And these guys that figure this out in your practice, how many different ways have you tried reactivation, recall, reappointments, appointment confirmations? We looked at a practice last week that had an 82% attendance rate. 18% of their patients were either no-showing or canceling. It's really hard to run a practice with that number. It's really, really difficult. How can we figure out what the problem is and do it rapidly and get through? The data tells us where we need to look, but then we need to implement the strategies, and we need to start really driving on that culture of learning. What is keeping us back? What are the barriers that are standing in our way? If we're not seeing early signs of improvement as we're dealing with this team member, David talked earlier about giving people just one thing. Just pick one thing they need to do. If you've got a C player and they can't improve one single thing in the next 30 days, it doesn't matter all the other things they need to improve. It's irrelevant. If you have a C player that has 5 things that they need to fix in order for you to keep them employed, and they can't even fix one of them, then you have your answer on what needs to come next. We don't need to overwhelm people, and we need to look for these early signs. I talked at the beginning. If you've got a person at this point and they need to get to this point, right? If they got to get from point A or as a C player to point B as an A player, and it's going to take you a month to get them there, that might be time you want to invest bridging that gap. But if they've got so much going on that it's going to take 6 months to get them here, you may decide that that's not the right investment of your time and money. If the barriers are too great or there's too many of them, you might be having a different conversation. But look for early signs of improvement, because if you don't see the improvement early, you're not going to see it later either. How do we get our team to be aware? How do we turn all the lights on? If there's not enough improvement, we need to immediately escalate that conversation. If we don't, then the team member is going to draw their own conclusions. We've got to be very vocal about the team member being really, really clear that there is really an issue. If the team member isn't really clear that there's an issue, they're not going to change. If the team member doesn't think there's a problem and you do, if you're just coaching them and they don't think they're actually fixing a problem, they just think that you like talking to them, you're not going to see improvement. You've got to be clear that there is a problem, and here's the coaching that I'm giving you to fix this problem. And these two things work hand in hand. Think of it a little bit as the kind of the carrot and stick, right? They have to know that they need to improve, and the challenge and the support. Here's how I'm going to help you fix this. And then we need to document this stuff. It can be as simple as an email. Most states are something called at-will employment, right? We don't need to get crazy with documentation and all kinds of HR policies and all this stuff. We just need to send an email out. Here's what happened. Here's what I expect. Here's what you're going to do. And what I found is it's really, really important to send an email, not to document for proof or for evidence. It's really, really important to always send an email, because oftentimes I find that what I said to the person and what they heard were two different things. Almost, I'll say 75% of the time, what I say and what they hear are two different things. And when I can distill it into a couple sentences in an email, it provides enormous clarity. And you may find initially when you start doing this that it actually leads to, hey, can we chat about this? I didn't understand this from our conversation. Oh gosh, great. Let's have a quick follow-up chat and talk about what really needs to happen here. If you can't put it into an email, they're going to walk away with their perceptions and you're going to walk away with your perceptions. And I mean, I have literally, I'm sure you guys have too, had cases where you tell an employee, you think you told them, if you don't fix this, you're going to be unemployed. And they walk away from the conversation and they think, oh man, he loves everything I'm doing. I mean, it's almost been that bad sometimes. And sending a quick follow-up email, 3, 4, 5 sentences, what's going on, what we're doing, and the next steps is an incredibly powerful way just to make sure that you're absolutely aligned and the team member understands what the issue is.
Yeah.
How does this come?
If I can add something to that, one of the things that we've seen that I've seen in sitting with office managers at the time to write a performance plan is sit down, we're going to write it. I'm there to support them. And you see them go like this. Oh, okay. What do I want to say here? Giving them the template. Oh man, what do I want to say? Well, if they don't know exactly what they need to say or type or verbalize in the performance plan at the time sitting down, what is the likelihood that the team member that's about to receive the performance plan is clear on the areas that they needed to improve on that would have kept them from ever getting the performance plan to begin with.
Yeah.
And it's normal. It's nobody's fault. It's just, this is the way things happen, and they are happening in practices, and we're trying to help alleviate.
And that's something else I despise, is yearly and annual reviews. They're awful.
Yeah.
Because once a year, once a year, we're going to sit down and evaluate you. And I'm going to remember everything you did over the past year, and you're going to remember everything you did over the past year. Yep. And then we're going to put this whole box, this whole cluster together, and somehow we're going to come up with a grade for how you did over the past year. It makes no sense. They're telling somebody 6 months after they screwed up that, hey, remember you screwed up 6 months ago, is pointless. If you didn't tell them at the time and you didn't correct the behavior at the time, it's pointless. And if you did correct the behavior at the time, you don't need to repeat it 6 months later or 9 months later or 12 months later. Annual reviews are corporate America's big joke on business. That's what I think of them. And we've got to communicate frequently and communicate often and communicate honestly. When you get to the next follow-up point, you may have a situation where there's a lack of improvement, right? Hopefully not. 90% of the time, stuff improves. You may have a situation where that is not the case, right? So we need to create a formal performance plan that articulates what is about to happen, the expectations, the timelines, and the plan to get there. Oftentimes, these are one-pagers, right? If we can't distill it down to a page or two, it's probably not simple enough for an employee to take action on, right? So as we talked earlier, we've got to resolve issues. We've got to resolve the issues that our team sees. They expect us, our team wants us to resolve issues that are impacting the practice because they do care about the practice. A formal performance plan creates that crystal clarity that the next step is offboarding, right? If there is not if there's not a next step that is offboarding, and you've been talking to somebody and talking to them, and it's not improving, then we have to escalate what's about to happen. And you're doing this out of care for the practice, for the other team members, as well as out of care for this employee that's not performing. There should never be any surprises when you terminate somebody, right? Because you've had this conversation, it's been reduced to an email. At some point, maybe there was even a performance plan that went out. And at this point, we've already had 2 or 3 or 4 conversations about what needs to change in order for you to stay employed here. I had a mentor once tell me that he's never fired somebody in his life. And I said, what do you mean, Keith? You've never fired somebody? He says, well, I don't fire people. He says, when somebody's not doing their job, I go talk to them and I try to help them. I said, okay. He goes, the second time I go talk to them, I tell them how important it is for them to do their job and how important it is that, they don't have to come chase me for a paycheck. I don't want to have to chase you to do their job. He said the third time that they have the same problem, he just takes them an empty banker box. And he says, listen, if you can't do this job, then you have to pack your stuff up and you're going to quit. And I kind of chuckled and said, so you've never fired somebody, eh? He goes, well, maybe that's a little bit of a stretch. But the reality is they have to make the decision to do what you want. If you've communicated clearly and communicated often, and they understand what's about to happen, and they understand what they need to do, then the choice is 100% theirs if they're going to perform or not. You can't make them perform, but you can articulate that there's choice A and choice B, and that choice is theirs. And they're packing their own stuff up if they choose choice B, right? How are we going to offboard people? Well, This is the inevitable result if improvement isn't made. You have to offboard people. And you have to do it because if you keep C players on, your A players are going to leave. Top performing A players aren't going to hang around with C players. It doesn't happen. If you've ever had a really good person leave your practice, likely it was because you had C players or some kind of situation there that they didn't want, right? Maybe you've lost an A player because you couldn't compensate them enough. Well, then do we need to look at, do you have too many C players on your team? We talked last week in recruiting about golf. You know, if you've got 3 C players, that's like having 3 7-irons in your golf bag. You don't need 3 7-irons to hit a ball 100 yards. You need 1 A player 7-iron. Get rid of the C player 7-irons. You need 1 A player. And oftentimes, you know, when you're losing A players, it's either because they're not going to tolerate the culture, or you can't compensate them what they can command in the marketplace. And especially if you have 3 C players, you can't compensate another A player enough because you got too much salary. If you're at 30 or 35 or 40% salary as a percentage of your collections, if you're a $1.2 million practice, right? And which means you're doing $100,000 a month in collections. And if more than $30,000 of that went to paying for labor, benefits, contractors, associates, all team compensation, that's a little chubby. We want to be at 25%, right? And if you're at 30 or 35 or 40%, you're not going to be able to comp your A players enough, which means they're going to go somewhere else. That's the reality of things. The standards you set are what people will abide to. Your commitment is that this is what you're building. This is your practice. And you are the highest authority when it comes to building the practice. I'm just saying commit to what you're building and then stick to your standards. Set the standard and then stick with it, right? Most people will quit on their own accord when they're clear on what success is, and they're going to make that conscious decision not to do it. Susie, if you can't do these behaviors and generate these results, you're not going to be a good fit here. Susie's going to go find another job if she doesn't want to do that, right? That's the reality of it.